When you predicate your entire Discord persona and all of the activity you put onto the app, especially when it's dedicated to debating, onto basically being another guy's butt body and being an extension of their personality, the sort of individual in which you get is somebody known as careless. Somebody who's not known for his ability to beat people in debating, not known for his reputation, not known for his rhetoric, argumentation, or knowledge. Instead, what he's known for is pulling up in the same VCs that Infinity does, right? Usually, maybe whether or not Infinity has a loud mic or doesn't have a loud mic also actually severely affects his confidence whenever he begins speaking. Not only in particular does he not know anything about what he's talking about, but also you'll notice that from the interactions you have with him, that he basically has the tracking skills of a goldfish, right? But today, specifically, we aren't actually here to talk about just Careless because obviously spending your time and speaking about somebody who is just so obviously unintelligent that you basically run out of things or positive things at least to say about them 5 or 6 minutes after you begin speaking about them. Instead, we'll be talking about people like Careless because people like Careless are far more than Careless himself, which should also point out to you how completely average and not unique this guy is, right? Because the sort of traits in which he has are the run of the mill traits you'll find in any Discord group. Typically people who are like Careless specifically, um they actually have quite a few personality traits you'll be able to identify simply just by listening to them speak. There are a few. So one, you'll notice that within each word they actually speak, you'll notice that they swear every other word, right? They can't go 5 seconds without shouting the N word. They can't go 5 seconds without calling someone a bitch. They can't go 5 seconds without actually insulting another human being, simply because either A, their vocabulary is so limited that they don't have the option to say anything else, right? Or B, they just don't know enough, right, in terms of actually having anything to add to a real conversation to actually say anything else aside from insulting them. You'll notice that immediately these sorts of people get frustrated, right? Their first three responses either are along the lines of, oh, you're not good, right? You're a bitch. You don't make money, right? I make more money than you. You're a loser, right? Or basically just multiple personal attacks, right? And you'll notice that most of the time, in comparison to what the person actually did, and compare that to the actual response in which they are providing, you notice the vast disparity between the two. And the reason for this disparity is because these people have a fundamental inability to actually control their emotions, and they also just don't read, right? So take, for example, Careless. Yesterday, I was having a very nice conversation with him. Okay, I won't say nice because I'm not gonna lie, being completely frank, any conversation you have with Careless should already indicate to you that you're already wasting your time, right? But I was having a conversation with Careless, and typically I don't talk about anime debating crossverse stuff, but I just wanted to engage with Careless simply because, Careless actually has maybe some vague idea. He thinks he's really good, right? His father, Infinity, always comes into his defense every other time in which he engages in debating, and he thinks he's extremely good and extremely competent and extremely intelligent, or even he has the audacity to even think of himself as anything less than an intellectual parasitic worm, right? And he has enough confidence to think that. And because he has enough confidence to think that, I was thinking, oh, maybe there's something about Careless that actually warrants such confidence. So we begin the conversation. Right. Trivially, I don't debate crosswords, so the sort of strategies that obviously everyone's going to use whenever approaching a crosswords debate, I don't adopt them. For example, whenever people are actually debating crosswords, they have this weird conception within their mind that, okay, if I prove that my character can blow up a universe, somehow, if even if I don't know anything about the other character, that raises the probability of my character beating the other one. When in reality, it doesn't. Right? Instead, all it raises the probability of is my character having the character, quote unquote character they're defending, right? Having these specific sort of abilities. But because Careless doesn't understand that, he has no clue about probability theory, right? Instead, the first thing he did and the first sort of blunder he had within the conversation is actually trying to use priors in a manner which no other individuals like uses them. He just took priors to be pieces of evidence, right? Which again, you'll notice that that's already an extremely confused definition of the term, right? And if you ask him and put him on the spot what priors are, I doubt he'll actually be able to give you a proper answer, simply because most of his time and most of the things in which he does with his life are actually primarily dedicated to actually increasing Infinity's debate reputation. For example, you see Careless giving opinions on, say, debates about philosophy. Now, sit there and ask yourself, what does Careless actually know about philosophy? Well, here's a few things that Careless actually knows about philosophy that I think it would be very, very good for the video and also like to general conversations if we actually adopted these sorts of views, right? Which Careless holds, right? Because obviously, Careless trivially, like he's always correct, right? So, let's find this screenshot, and I'm pretty sure I also posted it on my community post, right? And you'll notice that this guy is actually just so completely and utterly confused that none of the things and none of the words that come out of his fat lips actually make any sense. So, firstly, he just said existence is the state of having properties. So, for something to exist, it has properties, right? So, under his view, Careless would have to agree unicorns exist, right? Flying dragons exist, right? Monsters exist, right? What's it called? Demons who poop out rainbows for dinner exist, right? And his answer, instead of, maybe walking back his definition, maybe that was an initial blunder, but he has the chance to, maybe preserve his own reputation. Instead of actually just sitting there and continuing to bite the bullet, maybe you walk back the definition that you're actually talking about. But no, instead, Careless in his nigh infinite arrogance, instead of doing that, he just bites the bullet and says, yes, unicorns do exist. Now, he tried to hedge it and go back on his initial statement and say, no, 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 by exist, I mean conceptual existence. But you'll notice in the screenshots, not only does he just not mention that, right? So it already shows a clear manner and a clear way in which he tries to hedge, right, what he's initially trying to talk about. But it also shows he doesn't actually know what he's talking about, right? If for you to exist conceptually, that just means you need to have properties, right? Then you may ask yourself, okay, what does it mean to exist physically under his view? Right? And don't worry, because Kellis actually tells us, right? To exist physically, what you need to do is to correspond physically. Now ask yourself, okay, what does that tell me about what it means to exist, right? Physically. What does that tell me? Right? You used the own word in its own definition and you used another extremely vague word within its definition. Do you think that, say somebody did not know anything about what it meant to exist physically, right? And then I told them to correspond physically. Does that tell them anything? The answer is no. It doesn't actually tell them anything, right? And don't worry though, because me in my infinite kindness, right? I asked him to actually explain what he actually means to correspond physically, right? He said to be of being. What does that mean? Right? The answer is look, whenever you see and whenever you interact with people like this, and you also notice whenever you interact with people like Infinity, right? Whenever you interact with, say, people like Akuno, especially Akuno, because for some odd reason, Akuno thought that there was something funny about Careless insulting me or Careless yelling, right? Or something funny about me pointing out his blunders, right? Or Infinity trying to say that I was blundering, right? And then Akuno laughing along. But in reality, there's not a single coherent thought behind Akuno's eyes, right? There's not a single thing going on within his brain, because not only does Akuno just not read up about any of the topics in which he actually attempts to talk about, because not only does he just lack any form of confidence, he has not won a single debate since he's actually started debating, to my knowledge, right? He got beat up by Jester, right? He gets beat by his parents, right? He gets beat up by Gyro. So in reality, he's losing on all fronts, especially when his ex-girlfriend literally cheated on him with a 13, 14-year-old. But we won't talk about that. Instead, we'll focus back on Careless, because in reality, if you sit down and ask yourself, right, what is the real difference between Careless and Arkana? And the answer is nothing. Both of them sit there. Their entire reputation is based off of leeching off of one man, which would be Infinity. Infinity himself also tried to get a reputation of like literally leeching off of Beetlejuice, right? Beetlejuice himself, who got his head kicked in by C, but we'll ignore that. But then when you ask yourself, okay, who's Beetlejuice actually debated, right? What recordings does he have? The answer is he doesn't really have recordings, right? Instead, these sorts of people intend, it's basically like a totem pole, right? Where each person just grabs and latches on to the penis of the person who's above them, right? And then the person who stands at the top of the totem pole, in this case, which would be Infinity, when you actually ask yourself, okay, why is Infinity competent? You notice that actually, and you try and analyze his debate style, you notice a few things. One, right, Infinity loves to ramble. He loves to speak, like immediately you put on a talking stick, he loves to speak for more than 5-6 minutes straight. And the reason why he loves to speak for more than 5-6 minutes straight is because not only does he need the time to think of more gibberish that he's going to actually let escape his lips each time he actually has the opportunity to speak, but also he needs to suppress his own carnal desires to stop everyone else from speaking, right? So that their arguments can defeat his own. Because, Infinity being the animal that he is alongside Careless, both of them have really strong animal instincts, meaning that their survival instincts compared to an actual regular competent human being are extremely heightened and extremely strong. So, whenever they're debating any sort of opponent, and I mean any because the bar to beat an opponent like Infinity and Careless is so low that these sorts of survival instincts you notice actually are triggered within any opponent, right? So, and you also notice that, like, in say Infinity is the bear with Eric, right? You can obviously see that, like, Infinity is just trivially, cripplingly incompetent, but we'll ignore that, right? Because of their survival instincts being so high, right? They'll try their hardest to stop their opponent from speaking, because any word which escapes their opponent's lips has a really high probability of defeating any argument Infinity or Careless's small minds are able to conjure, right? And the reason why that's true is because they don't actually take any time to actually read any papers, right? Which is why when I asked Infinity, right, is red a thing or are things red? He said red is a thing, right? And the reason why he said that is because he has no clue, right, what, like, also called what the substratum view on substances are, right? He doesn't know what the bundle theory is, so we can't even say that. Oh, maybe he's just a bundle theorist about substances, right? Where substances are just defined as a bundle of properties. Like, no, he doesn't know what that is, right? So clearly, what he's actually doing, he's just a completely confused view on actual metaphysics. Is a completely confused view on substances. And then you'll notice that Careless too has actually begun, right? Because there's a literal totem pole of confusion which is passed down from generation to generation. When you notice that Infinity likes to invoke the term essence whenever he begins debating, right? But then when you actually ask Careless why do essences exist, the reason why he thinks essences exist is because he just defines them as something which exists. It's like, come on, right? Like, literally, is that the extent of the amount of thought you've put into any sort of conversation, right? These sorts of people are absolute wastes of time to actually have conversations with. In fact, I don't really see the purpose of including these sorts of gibberators within your debate tier list. I don't see any sort of purpose aside from sitting there and allowing all of the chat to gain a good laugh, right? From absolutely exposing the sort of incompetent gibberish that these people love to let escape from their lips, right? Aside from exposing those sort of things, right? I don't know why anyone would debate, because really, what does actually make Infinity a tier 2 or a tier 3 debater that does not make Tanwin a tier 2 or tier 3 debater? What is the real distinction? Infinity knows about as much as Tanwin. Infinity doesn't argue far better than Tanwin. So why aren't they relative? Right? The answer is there's no good reason why he's better than Tanwin. There's no good reason why he's better than half of the people who he says are complete trash. That's not to say that these people are bad, but comparatively to Infinity and comparatively to, say, Careless and Careless's friend group, right? These are the sorts of people who he thinks are really bad. The only sort of person with any real sort of personality who stands out in comparison to, say, Careless and Infinity, right, would actually be Mono, surprisingly. At least whenever I'm speaking to Mono, I can get maybe a good laugh out of, like, listening to Mono, because not only can I actually make fun of him in, like, light jest, but also Mono is just a genuinely interesting human being to be around. But whenever it comes to Careless, there's nothing else that he can really offer in terms of conversation aside from sitting there yelling the N-word once or twice, right? And then once he's done yelling the N-word, oh my goodness. Once he's done yelling the N-word, right, he attempts to try and slip in arguments while he's speaking, right? And you notice that it never works. Right? Again, referencing back to the conversation which I had yesterday, right? And Infinity was sitting in chat trying to support Careless, trying to force Careless to give it the best shot he had, because really, whenever you don't have much intelligence, right, instead you need to make up for it in terms of actual grit. Maybe you can make up for it in terms of how much you can gibberate, right, within each conversation, right? But it's fine. So let's ask Infinity what he thinks. Infinity says a car is a property, right? It's like, okay, you can identify from a non-car. So ask yourself, okay, what are the properties of a car? And when I ask Infinity, the answer is, oh, well, the properties of a car is simply being a car. Well, that really told me a lot about what a car is. And the answer is, like, is kind of strange, because does Infinity think that cars have properties, right? Or do properties have cars, since cars are properties, right? Or no, do people have cars, right? Or are things cars, or are cars things? I'm pretty sure that was the question I asked him specifically, right? Well, are things red or is red a thing? And the answer he gave me was simply both, right? Red is a thing on its own, right? Because infinity has no real conception of what the distinction is between a substance, right, and a property. And because he has no real conception of it, right, then you know he tries to make up for it with literally any amount of noise that he can actually let come out of his lips, right? Which is also the same sort of reason why he thinks existence is a property, right? Isn't this the sort of Descartes like level argument, right? Which like he invoked in literally the 18 billionths, right? Which got refuted literally before infinity was even born, and yet he's still making the same age-old blunders that he has been for the entire period in which he's been born, right? But um you know, whenever you engage with these sorts of people, and hopefully maybe I can waste my own time and waste the time of the people, right, and engage with infinity and just see how much gibberish he can spit out of his lips, right, each actual conversation you have with him, or say Careless, right? Because for example, I ask Careless, okay, let's debate again, right? Let's debate again in good faith, right? But obviously there's no like engaging in good faith with somebody who's cripplingly incompetent. It's like asking to debate in good faith against a chimpanzee, right? Even though maybe they're not trying to be bad faith, it's just within their nature to not engage in actual coherent and productive conversations because he's a chimpanzee, right? There isn't really much else to say. But yeah, can somebody please tell me in reality one thing you enjoy about speaking to Careless or debating Careless, right? Because it's not as if you will learn anything from debating him, right? Because literally saying you learn something from debating Careless is actually about as likely as saying that, pigs will fly, right? Like, it's because it's just completely confused. Saying you learn from Careless, who learns from Careless? You laugh at Careless, right? Learning at Careless would be absurd. Learning at Careless would mean he's literally not careless. He's not the same entity, right? Like ask if, for example, there are loads of things you can do when actually approaching a conversation with that thing, right? For example, ask like whenever like Careless says something that's gibberish, just ask him what he means. And you'll notice that the more you ask him what he means whenever he says a term, you'll notice that the more it devolves into gibberish. For you to exist on his own terms, you need to have properties, right? So under his own view, dragons exist, right? If you go outside today, I hope you expect to see a dragon actually walking outside. Now, the sort of cope you give is that no, 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 no. I meant to physically exist, to have a value of more than zero. What does that even mean? To have a value of more than zero, like what does that mean? So like whenever we're trying to determine whether or not something exists or not, I'm asking myself, does it have a value of more than zero? Right? How do I identify if something has a value of more than zero? Right? And the answer is you don't really know because Careless himself doesn't know. Has he thought that far? Does he think? Right? Can he think? These are all relevant questions you need to ask yourself whenever engaging with such an entity, right? Because in reality, right, the only thing you can gain from the interacting with these people who every other word they say is a swear word, every other word they say is the N word, right? People who generally bring shame not only upon themselves but also their families, but also their races as black people, right? Because if you really think about it, right, every single time you will notice some racist guy, keep in mind these are the first people to yell out about, oh, these people are being racist, oh my god, that's a really bad thing, racism is bad. And it's like, yes, okay, it is bad, right? Then why are you going out of your way to be everything that a racist person would say you are, right? A loud, aggressive, doesn't really know a lot, not really, you aren't able to have a productive conversation with them, right? Beats their chest literally non-verbally, right? Um, what else does it do, right? He loves to indulge in loud yelling matches, right? He loves to raise his voice. He loves to insult people. He speaks very crude English, right? These sorts of people, right? I don't understand. Like also, I know this. Not saying that same. For example, my English is like supreme, right? but it's very easy to tell between say somebody like Careless and the average English speaker. But yeah, that's about it. Like for what you need to understand about, specimen D23, Careless, also known as dragons exist, also known as unicorns exist. Next time you interact with Careless, please make sure to ping him. Ask him, do dragons exist? Has he met a dragon today? Right. And see if he answers you properly. Right. Or see if he hedges his initial position from saying that to exist is to have properties, to conceptually exist, you need to have properties. As always, if you like these types of videos, please remember to like and subscribe. This has been Shinra, and I'm out.